Hi everyone, and welcome to Core Lecture 23. Today we'll discuss engaging counter-arguments effectively. Before we begin, you'll need the following materials for today's lecture assignment. You'll need access to your Week 12 homework document, as well as access to the internet and your Project 3 materials. The purpose and goals for today's lecture are as follows. We'll define the term counterargument, we'll understand the purpose of embedding counterarguments, and we'll examine strategies for civically engaging counterarguments. When we think about a counterargument, we can think about it as a published work or widely accepted idea that challenges or contradicts your argument. A way that they describe it in our textbook, they say, I say, and I really love this description, would be, they call them naysayers. So basically, the person to say, no, I disagree, or I'd like to challenge that, or I'd like to push back against that idea. So when we think about a counter argument, especially in academic writing, it is essentially a naysayer in some kind. Now, when we think about what a counter-argument represents and why counter-arguments exist, they often represent concerns, questions, or hesitations your audience may have regarding your topic and or your original argument. So I believe we discussed this briefly last week when we were looking at individual components of an argument. And basically, your audience is going to have concerns or perhaps thoughts going into reading your argument. And they will likely have at least one counter argument in mind, not to say that they themselves are posing that counter argument, but that they are likely familiar with at least one counter argument to whatever it is your thesis is suggesting. And so when we include a counter argument in our academic writing, that sort of acknowledges to the audience to say, hey, look, I know what you're concerned about and I'm going to talk about it. Purpose of counter argument. So one question I hear a lot, and I sometimes have myself is, why would I ever include a counter argument in my own writing? Why would I basically invite a naysayer? Why would I invite someone wanting to play the devil's advocate into my own original work? And initially, yes, it does sound very counterintuitive. However, when we take a step back and we think about what an academic argument does, or at least what it should do, counter-argument is more than appropriate and is incredibly rhetorically effective, I think, for persuading an audience to accept our thoughts or to pursue a certain plan of action. Now, like I said, and your audience, your readers will likely come into reading your argument already aware of at least one counter argument. Again, whether or not they're the one posing that counter argument, or perhaps it's just something they heard on the news or when chatting about this topic with someone else, they will still be aware of it. So by saying to your readers, hey, here's a counter argument that I know will likely be a factor in how you judge my argument, it lets them know that you are keeping them in mind. It lets them know that you are aware of their concerns as readers and you want to address them as the writer. Also, when we think about counter arguments, like I said, if readers are coming in to our own writing with these thoughts, this gives us as the writers, the opportunity to say, hey, listen, I understand this is a counter argument, but here's how I interpret it. Here's how I would address it. Here is how I would respond to it in my own words. And so it really gives us the opportunity to engage with this naysayer in a way that is best for the argument we're trying to make. And of course, I said at the beginning of this slide that we want to think about what counter arguments should do, or at least how counter arguments help us basically create effective academic arguments. Because remember, academic arguments or these papers that we're essentially writing contribute to some kind of ongoing conversation. And always within a conversation, there are going to be voices that agree, voices that kind of agree, and voices that disagree. And so oftentimes when we introduce and engage with a counter argument in our own academic text, we are positioning ourselves within an ongoing discussion to say, listen, this is what I'm arguing, this is what I'm advocating, and it stands to some degree in contrast with what this individual is saying or what this argument is suggesting. So counter arguments are a great way to say, hey, in this ongoing academic conversation, here's how I fit into the mix. And I can use a counter argument to sort of kind of position myself there. We do engage with counter arguments in our own writing. We want to ensure that the tenets of civil discourse are at the forefront of our mind the entire time. So we're going to look at ways in which we can do that over the next few slides. So the first thing that we'll want to do is we want to begin with a brief transition sentence or clause that clearly introduces the counter argument. So an example of this might be, while I argue for greater student voice regarding the use of student fees on the DSU campus, others suggest that power should remain with the administration. So we have got our argument to say, okay, I'm arguing for this, but on the other hand, others might argue something different or argue something that would challenge what I'm suggesting to you right now. So after we have done that, we want to provide a brief, objective, and fair summary of the counter-argument's rationale. So it's kind of giving credit where credit's due to say, okay, yeah, others say this. Specifically, this is what they're saying. And so we can see how engaging with or providing that summary really does better allow the reader to understand how we're coming to know the counter argument and how we might specifically address it given the argument that we are overall suggesting. Now, in that summary of the counter argument's rationale, we want to make sure that we are referencing at least one specific source. So we can look at counter arguments in a couple different ways. Sometimes counter arguments are just sort of vague ideas. So going back to project 2, it might be like a more general solution that you are using specific sources to support or to unpack. Other times in academic writing, especially depending on the conversation you're entering, you might just be engaging with a specific source. So for example, if you were writing on, let's say, vaccinations, right? Maybe your one big counter argument is that study that was published back, I believe, in the 1990s that started all of this concern about how vaccinations cause autism. Maybe like that is your one big counter argument that you are engaging with. So again, depending on your topic, it might be a bit more general or it might be a more specific source that you're engaging with. But if you are in a position, which I think most of you are, where you're more engaging with ideas, you want to make sure, again, that you've got at least one specific source that you can credit to that counter argument. So maybe what we say here, an example could be, in a study conducted by the Cal State Colleges Board, the leading authors found that institutions of higher education that allowed administrators to allocate student fees provided greater funding for student-run or student-designed programs. So we have a brief, objective, fair summary. So of what they're arguing, why they're arguing it, and of course we've got the conclusions in there from the counter argument to support that, but we've also named a specific source. So in this case, the authors of a report or a study conducted by the Cal State Colleges Board. So when we move on, so now that we have included that, we've told the reader we're about to engage with a counter argument. We have fairly and objectively. And now when we go back to this, you can see here in this summary, we're just telling the reader, okay, this is what they say. There's no content in this summary that should indicate, that you're about to disagree with it. Like if I were to just read, this chunk of a text in a study conducted, all I read is a summary. So you want to make sure that this part of your counter argument is objective, because again, that is how you are going to really approach this in a civil way, because you're not putting words in the author's mouth. You are not saying, suggesting they're saying something that they're not. You're not name calling. You're just saying, hey, this is pretty much what they said in the most clear, objective way possible. So once we've done that, then we can start to engage. But again, we want to do that civilly. We want to make sure that we are embracing the concept of agonism, viewing this source as an adversary, not an enemy. So we want to, in doing that, identify the counter argument shortcomings. So you'll recall that we actually kind of did this during last week's lecture on the components of an argument. Now, when we do this, so when we identify the counter argument shortcomings, some things that can kind of get us started on, okay, well, what is a shortcoming? We could seek to demonstrate how the counter argument is unfounded, irrelevant, and or out of date. Oftentimes, these are going to be the three strongest ways, or the three best ways to engage with a counter argument, to say, okay, it's illogical, or this is a moot point, or this is just simply out of date. The way that the methodology, the technology that they use, just it leaves so many more questions now than it does answers. So going back to our example, we could respond by saying, though the report finds that student organizations receiving administration allocated money saw increases in funding, it omits that the surveyed institutions reduced the number of student organizations by at least 40%. Okay, so there's the big thing that we want to say, okay, maybe your readers come into your argument saying, okay, students should have more of a say in how student fees are used. But maybe your reader comes in saying, oh, hey, I know of this study I heard from somewhere saying that if the administration does it, there's more money. So maybe the reader comes in already thinking that, or already having heard it somewhere. So this is your way to say, yeah, okay, I hear you. I know exactly, a concern that you might have regarding this topic. Here's a source, and, that actually speaks to that. Here's an issue, though, with this source and with the counter argument. And this is where you say, okay, yeah, maybe more funds, or maybe more clubs did get, or maybe clubs and organizations did get more funding, but that was because there were 40% fewer clubs and organizations. So of course, it had nothing to do with the money going up or being more smartly allocated. It was just the fact that there were fewer clubs and organizations going for what was available. So you have engaged in this argument by saying, okay, yes, this is what, another side is saying, but here are some issues we really want to be aware of. Here are some shortcomings that might douse your favoritism for the counter argument and may persuade you to accept the argument that I am suggesting. So, after we have dismissed, or engaged with, I should say, the counter argument by saying, yeah, okay, I've provided a transition, I've summarized, I've identified the shortcoming, we then want to return to our original argument. Now, in doing so, we want to emphasize how our arguments effectively respond to the counter argument, and we want to articulate how our arguments accounts for the counter argument shortcoming. So we could say these findings unfortunately show that when administrators are solely charged with distributing student fees, they prioritize only a handful of student organizations that often do not accurately reflect student needs. Reflect the needs and interests of students. If the students, though, had a greater say in the allocation of student fees, all parties could better ensure funding is distributed in a way that represents students' needs. So we read this and we say, okay, we've identified the shortcomings. Remind the reader of what those shortcomings are, but then we're circling it back around. We're coming full circle to say, okay, well, this is how my argument responds to the shortcomings that I have identified in the counter argument. So again, it reminds the reader how our argument, we're not just leaving the counter argument hanging, we're not just leaving it there, but we are saying, okay, here is how what I am suggesting sort of makes that a non-issue anymore. That kind of dismisses the issue of the counter argument that the reader may be bringing in with them. So here's what I would like you to do then for a lecture assignment. For the lecture assignment, I'd like you to reference your materials from Project 3 and or locate a counter argument using the library database. So if you found one in Project 3, awesome, super. If you have not located a counter argument yet, now is the time to do so. And you can do that, I think, most effectively through the DSU library databases. You'll then need to compose a brief write-up about 75 words that engages civilly with the counter argument. Your write-up, though, should include a transition introducing the counter argument, a fair summary of the counter argument citing at least one specific source, a discussion regarding the shortcomings of the counter argument, and a return to your own original argument. Remember, you can use this material in your project for drafting material. So you could very easily, if this ends up working out as a good counter argument for what you're ultimately going to propose in Project 4, you can use this content in your rough draft and perhaps even in your final draft. So remember, this is more or less a generative assignment. Okay, weekly homework. You are going to include the Core Lecture 23 summary and assignment in your Week 12 homework submission. Overall, your Week 12 homework submission should include the summaries and assignments for Core Lectures 22 and 23, as well as a mini lecture of your choice. And that is all due to the appropriate assignment submission folder on Canvas before 11:59 p.m. on Sunday, November 10th. If you have any questions or if you'd like to discuss any of these concepts further, please don't hesitate to contact me via Canvas DM. All right, everyone, until next time.